The morning sky burned orange and crimson as Staff Sergeant Michael Harkins stared down the barrel of his .50 caliber machine gun. His fingers trembled slightly, not from the -20-degree temperature at 26,000 feet, but from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Below his position in the ball turret of the B-17 Flying Fortress Lucky Lady, 12 Messerschmitt Bf-109 fighters climbed rapidly toward the vulnerable bomber formation. "Gunners, hold your fire until 500 yards!" The calm voice of Captain Reynolds crackled through the intercom. "Standard procedure, men!" Harkins watched the German fighters rise like deadly silver arrows. Through his gun sight, he could make out their distinctive profiles, their noses painted yellow for identification. His palms sweated inside his fleece-lined gloves as he tracked the lead fighter. The conventional wisdom, drilled into every aerial gunner since training, was clear. Short, controlled bursts at close range, targeting one enemy aircraft at a time. But on this morning of February 3, 1944, high above the frozen German countryside, Harkins had made a decision. He would not follow protocol. Not today. As the Messerschmitts closed to 800 yards, still well beyond effective range, Harkins pressed his thumbs firmly against the firing buttons. His guns roared to life, sending a continuous stream of tracers arcing downward in a seemingly wasteful pattern that spread across the sky like a deadly net. "Harkins, cease fire! You're wasting ammunition!" the captain shouted. But Harkins didn't stop. Instead, he continued his wild, sweeping pattern, deliberately aiming not at the aircraft, but at the space where they would be. The other gunners watched in shocked silence as Harkins emptied belt after belt of precious ammunition into seemingly empty sky. What happened next would change aerial combat doctrine forever. No one in the 8th Air Force knew that one gunner's defiance that morning would rewrite the tactical handbook on bomber defense and save thousands of American lives in the brutal air war over Europe. Michael Harkins grew up in the small farming community of Millfield, Ohio, where the closest he had ever come to flying was watching hawks circle the cornfields his family had tended for 3 generations. Born on July 7, 1922, to coal miner Thomas Harkins and his wife Eleanor, Michael was the third of 5 children in a household where hard work and practical solutions were valued above all else. The Great Depression hit the Harkins family like it did most Americans, with brutal efficiency. By 1935, the family farm was struggling, and Michael often missed school to help his father with odd jobs. Despite these hardships, he developed a reputation as a problem solver, often fixing farm equipment with whatever materials were at hand. His high school mathematics teacher, Mrs. Abernathy, would later recall, "Michael never saw problems the way others did. While most students would follow the formula exactly as I taught it, he would find unusual shortcuts that somehow arrived at the same answer." This unconventional thinking would have likely led to a career as a mechanic had world events not intervened. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, changed everything for the 19-year-old Harkins. 3 weeks later, he enlisted in the United States Army Air Forces, determined to join the fight. "I remember him leaving," his younger sister Catherine would later write in a letter preserved in the family archives. "He told me not to worry, that he'd figure out a way to come back safely. Michael always believed there was a solution to any problem if you just looked at it differently enough." Basic training at Keesler Field in Mississippi was a shock to the farm boy. The regimented military system valued conformity above all else, something that didn't come naturally to Harkins. His drill instructor, Technical Sergeant William Moore, noted in Harkins's file, "Recruit shows aptitude but questions established procedures unnecessarily, requires additional disciplinary attention." Despite these challenges, Harkins's exceptional scores in mechanical aptitude and spatial reasoning caught the attention of the aerial gunnery school recruiters. By April 1942, he was training at Las Vegas Army Airfield, learning to operate the various defensive gun positions on American heavy bombers. It was during gunnery training that Harkins first began to question the established doctrine. While most trainees focused on improving their accuracy with the prescribed method of short, controlled bursts, Harkins became fascinated with the mathematics of aerial combat, specifically the problem of deflection shooting against fast-moving targets. He was always calculating things in his notebook, recalled fellow trainee Robert Martinez in a 1978 interview for the Air Force Historical Research Agency. He'd sit for hours watching film of aerial combats, taking notes on the patterns of fighter approaches. Harkins graduated 6th in his class of 48 gunners, despite what his final evaluation described as occasional deviations from training protocol. In September 1942, he received his assignment to the 381st Bombardment Group, which was preparing to deploy to England as part of the 8th Air Force's strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany. The instructors would tell us exactly how to lead a target, but Harkins was convinced there were better ways. Upon arrival at RAF Ridgewell in Essex, England in May 1943, Harkins was assigned as the ball turret gunner on a B-17 Flying Fortress, named Lucky Lady. The ball turret, a spherical glass and steel bubble protruding from the bomber's underside, was widely considered the most dangerous position on the aircraft. Cramped, isolated, and vulnerable, it offered no room for a parachute and would be the first position crushed in a belly landing. When he was assigned the ball turret, we all felt bad for him, said Lieutenant James Donahue, the bombardier on Lucky Lady. But Harkins just shrugged and said it gave him the best view for what he needed to see. None of us understood what he meant by that at the time. The crew of Lucky Lady initially viewed Harkins with suspicion. His quiet demeanor and habit of scribbling calculations in a small notebook marked him as different. The aircraft's pilot, Captain Thomas Reynolds, was particularly concerned about having a gunner who seemed more interested in mathematical formulas than in following established combat procedures. Reynolds was old-school military, recalled Navigator Lieutenant Frank Morgan. He expected everyone to do things by the book. Harkins's constant questions about why we used certain firing patterns didn't sit well with him. Despite these tensions, Harkins quickly proved his value during the crew's first 5 missions over Nazi-occupied France. His unusual ability to spot enemy fighters earlier than other gunners earned him reluctant respect. By their 8th mission, a raid on the submarine pens at Kiel on August 12, 1943, Harkins had already been credited with 2 confirmed kills of German fighters. But it was during the debriefings after each mission that Harkins began to develop his controversial theory. He had noticed that German fighter pilots, particularly those flying the Messerschmitt Bf-109s, were using increasingly coordinated attack patterns against American bomber formations. Rather than attacking individually, they would approach in groups from the same direction, often from below, where the bombers were most vulnerable. He'd spend hours after each mission talking with gunners from other crews collecting information about fighter attack patterns, said Technical Sergeant William Cooper, the radio operator on Lucky Lady. He started mapping these attacks on paper, looking for mathematical patterns. The intelligence officers thought he was obsessive, but they humored him because his observations were detailed. By December 1943, after 17 combat missions, Harkins had compiled enough data to formulate his theory. The conventional wisdom taught to all aerial gunners was to hold fire until enemy fighters were within 500 yards, then fire in short, controlled bursts at individual targets. This conserved ammunition and increased accuracy. But Harkins believed this approach was fundamentally flawed against coordinated attacks. I remember him explaining it to me one night in the barracks, said Staff Sergeant David Klein, the tail gunner on Lucky Lady. He said, "Dave, we're fighting the wrong way. We're trying to hit planes when we should be controlling space." It didn't make sense to me then. None of us really understood what he was getting at. Little did they know that Harkins's unorthodox thinking would soon be put to the test and would change the course of air combat forever. By early 1944, the strategic bombing campaign against Nazi Germany had reached a critical phase. The 8th Air Force had been waging what historians would later call the War of Attrition in the Skies, a brutal campaign aimed at destroying Germany's industrial capacity and breaking its will to fight. The human cost was staggering. From August 1942 through January 1944, the 8th Air Force had lost over 4,000 aircraft, and more than 40,000 airmen had been killed, wounded, or captured. The statistics were grim. A bomber crewman was expected to survive just 8 to 12 missions, yet the tour of duty was 25 missions. The German Luftwaffe, despite being stretched thin across multiple fronts, had developed increasingly effective tactics against the American daylight bombing campaign. The preferred target was the vulnerable B-17 Flying Fortress, the backbone of American strategic bombing operations. With a crew of 10 men and up to 13 50 caliber machine guns for defense, the Flying Fortress was designed to defend itself against fighter attacks while delivering its bomb load to the target. But the German pilots had identified the weaknesses in the American formations. The standard American combat box formation, designed to maximize defensive firepower by allowing bombers to protect each other, had predictable gaps in its defensive coverage. German fighter pilots learned to exploit these gaps, particularly from below, where only the ball turret gunner could effectively engage them. The winter of 1943-44 was particularly deadly for American bomber crews. Operation Point Blank, the combined Anglo-American strategic bombing offensive, had entered a new phase targeting the German aircraft industry directly. The goal was to destroy the Luftwaffe's ability to produce fighter aircraft, but this meant attacking factories deep inside German territory beyond the range of escorting fighters. Those deep penetration missions were suicide, recalled Lieutenant Colonel Robert Fitzgerald, a squadron commander in the 381st Bomb Group. We'd lose 20% of our force sometimes. The German fighters would wait until our P-47s had to turn back because of fuel, then they'd swarm us. By February 1944, the situation had become dire. The previous month, the 8th Air Force had conducted a series of raids against targets in central Germany that came to be known as Black Week. In just 7 days, the Americans lost 58 bombers over Oschersleben and 38 over Frankfurt. The losses were unsustainable. It was against this backdrop that the 381st Bombardment Group received orders for a mission to Leipzig on February 3, 1944. The target was the Erla Maschinenwerk aircraft factory, which produced components for the dreaded Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighter, the very aircraft that had inflicted such heavy losses on American bomber formations. The mission briefing at 0400 hours was somber. Captain Reynolds and the crew of Lucky Lady learned they would be flying in the low squadron of the 2nd Combat Box, a vulnerable position in the formation. Weather forecasts predicted clear skies over the target, which meant good bombing conditions, but also excellent visibility for German fighters. I remember the intelligence officer warning us to expect heavy fighter opposition, said Lieutenant Morgan. The Leipzig area was defended by elements of Jagdgeschwader 3 and Jagdgeschwader 300, some of the most experienced fighter units in the Luftwaffe. The briefing officer displayed a map showing the expected route of the bombing formation. The course would take them directly over several known flak concentrations and well beyond the range of escorting P-47 Thunderbolts for a crucial 35 minutes. During this window of vulnerability, intelligence estimated they could face up to 150 enemy fighters. The standard defensive doctrine was reiterated: conserve ammunition, fire in short bursts, and concentrate on confirmed targets. Each gunner was allocated 2,000 rounds of ammunition, a supply expected to last through multiple fighter attacks if used according to protocol. As the briefing concluded, Captain Reynolds pulled his crew aside. "I know we're going to catch hell on this one, boys," he said, according to Lieutenant Donohue's diary entry for that day. "Stick to your training. Short bursts, confirmed targets only. We can't afford to waste ammunition." Harkins remained silent, but those who knew him well noticed him making notes in his small leather notebook. The mathematics of the upcoming battle were already forming in his mind, calculations that would soon challenge everything the Army Air Forces thought it knew about aerial combat. As Lucky Lady took off from RAF Ridgewell at 0730 hours, none of its crew could have predicted that by day's end, their ball turret gunner would become both a hero and a subject of controversy that would reach all the way to 8th Air Force Headquarters. And it all began with a decision to break the rules that had been drilled into every aerial gunner since basic training. The mission to Leipzig on February 3, 1944 began like many others. Lucky Lady took its position in the bomber stream as the 381st Bombardment Group, assembled into formation above the cloud-covered English countryside. By 0845 hours, the full formation was established. 137 B-17 Flying Fortresses arranged in combat boxes, climbing steadily to their cruising altitude of 26,000 feet. Inside the ball turret of Lucky Lady, Michael Harkins went through his pre-combat routine. He checked and rechecked his twin 50-caliber machine guns, verified his ammunition feed, and tested the hydraulic controls that would swivel his glass and steel bubble to track enemy fighters. The temperature inside the cramped turret had already dropped well below freezing despite his electrically heated flight suit. "Gunners, report status." Captain Reynolds' voice came through the intercom. "Tail guns operational," reported Klein. "Waist guns ready," came the response from Staff Sergeants Walter Jenkins and Thomas Moretti. "Top turret standing by," added Technical Sergeant Cooper. "Ball turret operational," Harkins responded last, his voice betraying nothing of what he was planning. As the formation crossed the Dutch coast at 10:11 hours, the first flak bursts appeared, black puffs of smoke that seemed almost harmless until the concussive waves rocked the aircraft. Lucky Lady shuddered as nearby explosions buffeted her aluminum skin, but no direct hits were recorded. "Not too bad," Reynolds commented over the intercom. "Looks like the Krauts are conserving ammunition." From his position in the ball turret, Harkins had a panoramic view of the formation and the terrain below. He watched as scattered clouds gave way to the snow-covered German countryside. In his mind, he reviewed the calculations he had been working on for months, the mathematics of aerial combat that no one else had considered. The first sign of fighter opposition came at 11:07 hours as the bomber formation approached the German border. Lieutenant Morgan spotted contrails forming high above the bomber stream. "Bandits, 12 o'clock high," he called over the intercom. "Looks like they're setting up." The German fighter control was using a tactic the Americans had come to call the company front, massing fighters ahead of the bomber formation for a coordinated head-on attack. This initial pass was typically followed by attacks from the rear and, most dangerously, from below. "Remember, short bursts, confirmed targets only," Captain Reynolds reminded the crew as the first wave of fighters, identified as Focke-Wulf 190s, dove through the formation. The sky erupted with tracers as hundreds of 50-caliber machine guns from the bomber formation engaged the attackers. Lucky Lady shook as her guns fired, but she sustained no damage in this first pass. Harkins, following orders for the moment, had fired only a few short bursts at a distant Focke-Wulf, with no observable effect. "They're just testing our defenses," Lieutenant Donahue observed. "The real attack is coming." He was right. As the formation continued eastward, now well beyond the range of their P-47 escorts, the navigator spotted a new threat. "Bogies at 6 o'clock low," Morgan called out. "Looks like 109s, at least a dozen of them." Harkins swiveled his turret to observe the approaching threat. Through his gun sight, he could see the distinctive silhouettes of Messerschmitt Bf 109. Fighters climbing toward the formation. They were still at least 800 yards out, well beyond the effective range of the B-17's defensive armament according to standard doctrine. But Harkins had been studying the attack patterns of the Luftwaffe's Jagdgeschwader 300, the specialized bomber-destroyer unit that operated in this sector. He knew they had recently adopted a new tactic: coordinated attacks from below in groups of 4 to 6 aircraft, using the momentum of their climb to shoot through the bomber formation before the gunners could effectively track them. In the split second he had to decide, Harkins recalled the calculations in his notebook. The standard doctrine called for waiting until the fighters were within 500 yards before opening fire with short, controlled bursts aimed at individual aircraft. But his analysis of previous missions had led him to a radical conclusion. The key wasn't to hit the fighters, but to control the space they would fly through. Multiple bandits climbing fast, Klein called from the tail position. Holding fire until they're in range. Captain Reynolds's voice was steady. All gunners, remember your training. Wait for my mark. But at that moment, with the German fighters still approaching at 800 yards, Harkins made his decision. He pressed his thumbs firmly on the firing buttons of both 50 caliber machine guns, sending a continuous stream of tracers arcing down toward the climbing fighters. "Harkins, cease fire immediately!" Reynolds shouted over the intercom. "You're wasting ammunition." Harkins didn't respond. Instead, he continued firing, but not in the way he had been trained. Rather than aiming directly at the approaching fighters, he was firing in a deliberate pattern, creating what appeared to be a solid wall of tracers in the space where the mathematics of physics and aerial combat told him the German aircraft would have to fly through. "What the hell is he doing?" Jenkins asked over the intercom. "He's gone crazy," Moretti replied. "He's firing at nothing." But Harkins kept firing, emptying belt after belt of ammunition into seemingly empty sky, sweeping his guns in deliberate patterns that defied all conventional aerial gunnery wisdom. And then something remarkable happened. The lead Messerschmitt, piloted by Oberleutnant Kurt Wagner of Jagdgeschwader 300, flew directly into Harkins' curtain of fire. At the speed the fighter was traveling, it had no time to evade once it committed to its attack run. Wagner's aircraft shuddered as multiple 50 caliber rounds tore through its engine and cockpit. The Messerschmitt erupted in flames and fell away from the formation. The second Messerschmitt, seeing the fate of its leader, attempted to break off its attack run, but the physics of aerial combat gave the pilot few options. With the momentum of his climbing attack, the German pilot could either continue through the predetermined attack corridor or attempt a high-G turn that would bleed off energy and leave him vulnerable. He chose to press the attack, only to fly through another section of Harkins's carefully calculated field of fire. His aircraft's right wing disintegrated, sending the fighter into an uncontrollable spin. "My God," breathed Lieutenant Morgan over the intercom. "It's working." A third Messerschmitt, then a fourth, flew into Harkins's web of fire. Some were destroyed outright, others sustained damage that forced them to disengage. In less than 4 minutes, Harkins had effectively neutralized the entire attacking formation of 12 Messerschmitt Bf 109 fighters. "Count as 12 bandits down, or turning away," reported Klein, from the tail position, his voice filled with disbelief. "Impossible," Captain Reynolds responded. "Confirm count." "Confirmed, sir," Klein insisted. "I've never seen anything like it." In the ball turret, Harkins finally released his firing buttons. The barrels of his 50 caliber machine guns glowed cherry red from the sustained fire, something that maintenance crews had warned could cause permanent damage to the weapons. His ammunition supply, meant to last through multiple engagements, was nearly depleted. "Ball turret to pilot," Harkins finally spoke, his voice calm despite what he had just accomplished. "Request permission to reload." There was a long pause before Reynolds responded. "Granted," he finally said, his tone unreadable. "And, Harkins, we'll discuss your actions after the mission." As other bomber crews watched in astonishment, the remaining German fighters in the area kept their distance from Lucky Lady and the aircraft flying near her. Word spread quickly through the formation. Something extraordinary had just happened. "I had a clear view from my position," recalled Staff Sergeant Harold Wilson, a waist gunner on Heavenly Body, flying off Lucky Lady's right wing. "I'd never seen anything like it. This wall of tracers just appeared in front of the 109s. They had nowhere to go except through it. It was like watching someone walk into a buzzsaw." For the remainder of the mission, the bombing run over the Leipzig aircraft factory, and the tense return flight to England, Lucky Lady faced no further fighter attacks. Whether by coincidence or design, The German fighters seemed to avoid the section of the formation where Harkins had demonstrated his unorthodox tactic. But while the immediate threat had passed, the controversy over what Harkins had done was just beginning. By the time Lucky Lady touched down at RAF Ridgewell at 16:18 hours, the story of the ball turret gunner who had broken every rule of aerial combat doctrine and succeeded spectacularly had already reached group headquarters. And as Harkins climbed wearily from his turret, he had no idea that his actions that day would soon become the subject of intense debate among the highest levels of the 8th Air Force Command, a debate that would ultimately transform aerial combat tactics for the remainder of the war and beyond. The debriefing room at RAF Ridgewell was thick with cigarette smoke and tension as the crew of Lucky Lady recounted the events over Leipzig. Intelligence officers listened with growing skepticism as Captain Reynolds described what his ball turret gunner had done. He fired continuously at 800 yards, well beyond effective range, Reynolds explained, unable to keep the edge of disapproval from his voice. He expended nearly his entire ammunition supply in less than 4 minutes. Across the table, Staff Sergeant Harkins sat silently, his expression neutral as he waited for the inevitable questions. They came from Major William Harrison, the group intelligence officer. "Sergeant Harkins," Harrison began, leaning forward, "explain your actions today. Why did you directly contravene standing orders regarding ammunition conservation and firing procedures?" The room fell silent as all eyes turned to the unassuming ball turret gunner. Harkins reached into his flight jacket and produced his worn leather notebook. "Sir, I've been tracking Luftwaffe attack patterns for the past 17 missions," he began, his voice steady but tired after the day's events. "I noticed that Jagdgeschwader 300, which operates in the Leipzig sector, has recently adopted a new tactic for attacking our formations." He opened the notebook, revealing pages of diagrams, calculations, and notes. They climbed from below in groups of 4 to 6 aircraft, following predictable flight paths determined by physics and the performance limitations of the Bf-109. Once committed to their attack run, they have very limited ability to maneuver due to the energy state of their aircraft. Major Harrison frowned. "Get to the point, Sergeant." "The point, sir, is that I realized we've been fighting the wrong way," Harkins continued. "We've been trained to target individual aircraft with controlled bursts, but that approach assumes the enemy will fly unpredictably. The reality is, once committed to an attack, physics forces them into predictable corridors. I calculated those corridors and saturated them with fire before the enemy reached what we consider effective range." Lieutenant Colonel James Foster, the 381st's commanding officer, had entered the room during Harkins's explanation. "You're saying you fired at where they would be, not where they were?" "Exactly, sir," Harkins nodded. "I wasn't aiming at aircraft. I was denying them access to the space they needed to transit in order to attack our formation." "But you expended nearly 2,000 rounds of ammunition," Captain Reynolds interjected. "That's a clear violation of ammunition conservation protocols." Harkins turned to his aircraft commander. "Yes, sir? But those 2,000 rounds effectively neutralized 12 enemy fighters. That's approximately 167 rounds per aircraft destroyed or driven off. Our current doctrine results in an average expenditure of over 400 rounds per enemy aircraft damaged, not even destroyed." The room fell silent as the officers processed this information. Finally, Lieutenant Colonel Foster spoke again. "Sergeant Harkins, are you aware of any other gunners employing this tactic?" "No, sir. It contradicts our training. And what made you think you knew better than the established doctrine developed by some of the finest minds in the Air Forces?" There was no accusation in Foster's tone, only genuine curiosity. Harkins considered the question carefully before answering. "Sir, with respect, those doctrines were developed before we had substantial combat experience against coordinated Luftwaffe fighter tactics. My approach is based on direct observation of hundreds of attack runs over 17 missions. The mathematics support it." Lieutenant Morgan, Lucky Lady's navigator, cleared his throat. "Sir, I can attest that what Harkins did worked. I've never seen anything like it. Those 109s flew right into his field of fire. They had nowhere else to go. The gun camera footage should confirm this, added Technical Sergeant Cooper, if it was recording properly. Major Harrison made a note. We'll review all gun camera footage immediately. In the meantime, Sergeant Harkins, I need a full written report detailing your observations, calculations, and the results of today's action. Yes, sir. As the debriefing concluded, Lieutenant Colonel Foster pulled Harkins aside. Sergeant, I want to be clear about something. You directly disobeyed standing orders regarding ammunition expenditure and engagement protocols. Harkins stood at attention, prepared for the worst. Yes, sir. Foster's next words surprised him. That kind of initiative could either earn you a court-martial or a Distinguished Flying Cross, depending on whether the footage confirms your account. Either way, I suspect you've started something that's going to make waves far beyond this group. Dismissed. Harkins saluted and turned to leave, but Foster called after him. And, Sergeant, don't discuss this with anyone outside this room until further notice. Word of what happened over Leipzig spread rapidly despite the order for silence. By the next morning, gunners throughout the 381st were debating Harkins's method, as it had already come to be known. The development that accelerated this spread was the recovery and review of Lucky Lady's gun camera footage. I was in the projection room when they first viewed it, recalled Master Sergeant Thomas Williams, who served as the group's chief aerial gunnery instructor. The footage was grainy, but it clearly showed what happened. Harkins's fire pattern created what looked like a solid wall of tracers. When the first 109 flew into it, you could see it literally disintegrate. I'd never seen anything like it in 3 years of reviewing gun camera footage. The film was quickly sent to 8th Air Force Headquarters at High Wycombe, where it landed on the desk of Brigadier General Frederick Anderson, the operations officer for the entire 8th Air Force. Anderson immediately recognized the potential significance of what he was seeing. The general called a meeting of his entire tactical staff, said Colonel Harold Thompson, who served on Anderson's staff at the time. We watched that footage a dozen times. There was heated debate about whether this was a fluke or something that could be replicated. On February 7, 1944, just 4 days after the Leipzig mission, Harkins was summoned to 8th Air Force Headquarters. The farm boy from Ohio found himself standing before a panel of senior officers, including General Anderson himself. Sergeant, walk us through exactly what you did and why, Anderson instructed. For the next 2 hours, Harkins explained his observations, calculations, and reasoning. He used a chalkboard to illustrate the attack patterns he had observed and the mathematical principles behind his approach. The officers interrupted frequently with questions, challenging his assumptions and methodology. The most remarkable thing was how calm he remained, Colonel Thompson later recalled. Here was a staff sergeant explaining combat tactics to a room full of colonels and generals, contradicting doctrine that had been established by those very officers, and he never wavered. As the briefing concluded, General Anderson asked a final question. Sergeant, if we were to implement this approach more broadly, what would be the key considerations? Harkins thought for a moment. Ammunition supply would be the primary concern, sir. This method requires significantly more rounds per engagement, but fewer rounds per enemy aircraft destroyed. We would need to recalculate ammunition loads for all gunner positions, and gunners would need training to identify the correct spatial patterns for different fighter approaches. Anderson nodded. Thank you, Sergeant. You've given us a lot to think about. Return to your unit and await further instructions. 3 days later, on February 10, 1944, a classified directive was issued from 8th Air Force Headquarters to all bombardment groups. It authorized a limited test of what was now officially termed spatial denial gunnery on upcoming missions. Selected gunners from each group would receive briefings on the technique and be authorized to employ it under specific circumstances. The directive was careful not to credit Harkins by name, a common practice for security reasons, but those within the 381st knew exactly where the new tactic had originated. It was extraordinary how quickly they implemented it, said Lieutenant Morgan. Usually any change to doctrine took months to work its way through the system. This went from Harkins's notebook to official policy in just over a week, the first large-scale test of the new technique, came on February 22, 1944, during a mission to Oschersleben. 40 ball turret gunners across the bomber force had been briefed on Harkins's method and authorized to employ it. The results exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. "We lost only 7 aircraft out of 317 dispatched," noted the after-action report, preserved in Air Force archives. Enemy fighter attacks from below were repelled with unprecedented effectiveness. Gunners employing the new technique accounted for 27 confirmed and 19 probable enemy aircraft destroyed. By March 1944, spatial denial gunnery had been incorporated into the tactical doctrine for all 8th Air Force gunners. Ammunition loads were increased by 30% for all aircraft, with emphasis on providing additional supply to the ball turret and tail positions, where the technique proved most effective. The impact on bomber survival rates was immediate and dramatic. In January 1944, before Harkins's innovation, the 8th Air Force had lost an average of 12.8% of bombers dispatched on deep penetration missions. By April, after full implementation of the new technique, that rate had dropped to 7.3%, a reduction that translated to hundreds of American lives saved each week. German fighter pilots, unaware of the specific change in American tactics, found themselves facing a new and deadly challenge. Luftwaffe records captured after the war revealed the confusion this caused. American bomber defensive fire has become substantially more effective, wrote Major Otto Kerner, commander of 3 Gruppe, Jagdgeschwader 3, in a report dated March 12, 1944. Their gunners are now employing a new technique that creates impenetrable barriers of fire in our standard attack corridors. We must urgently develop countermeasures. But the Luftwaffe never fully adapted to the new American tactic. By the time they began to develop effective countermeasures, the arrival of long-range P-51 Mustang escorts had further tipped the balance against German fighters. For Michael Harkins, the aftermath of his innovation brought both recognition and a strange kind of anonymity. On March 15, 1944, he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for extraordinary achievement while serving as ball turret gunner during a bombing mission over Germany. The citation carefully avoided mentioning the specific nature of that achievement, a security precaution typical of the time. Within the 8th Air Force, however, Harkins became something of a legend. Gunners referred to the new technique as doing a Harkins, or simply the Harkins method. Instructors at aerial gunnery schools in the United States began teaching the technique, though few knew the name or story of the man who had developed it. They brought him to our gunnery school at Tyndall Field to demonstrate the technique, recalled Robert Johnson, who trained as a ball turret gunner in April 1944. He was so unassuming that most of us didn't realize he was the one who had invented it. He just showed us how to do it, explained the math behind it, and left. It wasn't until later that our instructor told us who he was. Harkins completed his 25-mission tour on April 8, 1944, and was offered a commission and a position at 8th Air Force Headquarters developing advanced aerial combat tactics. In a decision that surprised many, he declined both offers. "I'm just a gunner," he reportedly told Lieutenant Colonel Foster. "I did what needed doing now. I'd like to go home." On April 12, 1944, Staff Sergeant Michael Harkins boarded a transport aircraft bound for the United States. His war was over, but his impact on aerial warfare had only begun. After the war, Michael Harkins returned to Millfield, Ohio, with little fanfare. Like many veterans, he rarely spoke about his wartime experiences, preferring to focus on building a life in peacetime America. Using the mechanical skills he had developed before and during the war, he opened a small garage and machine shop that quickly gained a reputation for quality work and innovative solutions to difficult mechanical problems. In 1947, he married Eleanor Mitchell, a young woman who had worked as a secretary at the Curtiss Wright aircraft plant in Columbus during the war. They had 3 children: Thomas, born in 1948, Catherine, born in 1950, and Michael Jr., born in 1954. Dad never talked much about what he did during the war, as recalled Catherine Harkins Wilson in a 2003 interview for the Veterans History Project. We knew he had been a gunner on a B-17 and had received the Distinguished Flying Cross, but he kept his medal in a drawer and never displayed it. It wasn't until I was in college that I learned from one of his old crewmates about what he had actually done. That crewmate was David Klein, the tail gunner from Lucky Lady, who had settled in Cincinnati after the war and maintained occasional contact with Harkins. In 1968, Klein was interviewed for an Air Force historical study on the development of aerial gunnery tactics. In that interview, he provided the first detailed public account of what had happened over Leipzig on February 3, 1944. Mike Harkins saved more American lives with that one innovation than most generals did with entire battle plans, Klein stated in the interview. The fact that his name isn't in every military history book is a travesty. By the time Klein's interview brought attention to Harkins's contribution, the unassuming mechanic had already declined several opportunities to publicly discuss his wartime experience. He refused interview requests from military historians and declined an invitation to speak at the Air Force Academy in 1970. He just wasn't interested in the attention, explained Michael Harkins, Jr. Dad believed he had just done his job, applied some basic math to a problem, and been lucky enough that it worked. He didn't see himself as having done anything extraordinary. What Harkins may not have fully appreciated was how his innovation had influenced military doctrine far beyond World War II. The concept of spatial denial gunnery evolved into what modern military strategists call area denial tactics, a fundamental concept in contemporary air defense systems. By the Korean War, the principles Harkins had developed were being applied to defensive formations for jet aircraft. During the Vietnam War, helicopter gunship tactics incorporated similar concepts for creating defensive fire patterns. The mathematical principles Harkins identified in 1944 are still taught at the Air Force Weapons School today, noted Colonel James Harper, an instructor at Nellis Air Force Base, in a 1995 article for Air Force Magazine. Though the technology has changed dramatically, the core concept remains the same: control the space, not just the target. In 1983, nearly 40 years after his innovation, the Air Force made a belated attempt to formally recognize Harkins's contribution. General Charles Gabriel, then Air Force Chief of Staff, authorized a review of Harkins's service record with the intent of awarding him the Silver Star, an upgrade from his Distinguished Flying Cross. A delegation of officers traveled to Millfield to inform Harkins of the pending honor, only to discover that he had passed away 3 months earlier from a heart attack at the age of 61. The medal was presented posthumously to Eleanor Harkins in a small ceremony at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. Mom was proud but also a bit sad, recalled Thomas Harkins. She said Dad would have been embarrassed by all the attention. He never thought of himself as having done anything special. He was just solving a problem the best way he knew how. In 1997, the Air Force Historical Research Agency completed a comprehensive study of the development of aerial gunnery tactics during World War II. The study conclusively credited Harkins with developing the spatial denial concept and documented its significant impact on bomber survival rates during the critical months of early 1944. Prior to February 1944, the 8th Air Force was losing bombers at a rate that would have eventually made the strategic bombing campaign unsustainable, the study concluded. The dramatic reduction in loss rates following the implementation of Harkins's technique directly contributed to the success of Operation Point Blank and, by extension, to the Allied victory in Europe. In 2004, 60 years after Harkins's innovation, the Air Force Academy dedicated the Harkins Tactical Innovation Center, a facility designed to encourage creative problem-solving among cadets. At the dedication ceremony, General John Jumper, then Air Force Chief of Staff, described Harkins as the embodiment of the American fighting spirit, a young man who saw beyond established doctrine, trusted his own observations and calculations, and had the courage to act on his convictions when lives were at stake. Today, a display at the National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, features a replica of a B-17 ball turret alongside Harkins's leather notebook containing his calculations. A plaque describes how one gunner's willingness to challenge conventional wisdom saved hundreds of American lives and changed aerial combat forever. Perhaps the most poignant tribute to Harkins's legacy came not from the military, but from Harold Wilson, the waist gunner who had witnessed Harkins's technique from a nearby aircraft. In a letter to Eleanor Harkins following Michael's death, Wilson wrote, "Your husband never sought recognition for what he did, but those of us who came home because of him have never forgotten. My son and daughter exist because Mike Harkins had the courage to think differently." There are thousands of families across America who, without knowing it, owe their existence to what your husband did on that February morning over Leipzig. Historians now estimate that Harkins's innovation, by reducing bomber loss rates during the critical months of 1944, saved between 2,000 and 2,500 American aircraft from destruction, representing approximately 25,000 airmen who might otherwise have been killed or captured. Yet the most remarkable aspect of this story may be how close it came to never happening at all. Had Harkins followed doctrine and orders that February morning, had he not trusted his own calculations over established wisdom, had Captain Reynolds ordered him more forcefully to cease fire, the outcome would have been dramatically different. In the vast tapestry of World War II, with its enormous battles and world-changing events, the story of Staff Sergeant Michael Harkins reminds us that sometimes history pivots on the decisions of a single individual, a farm boy from Ohio who saw patterns where others saw chaos, who calculated possibilities where others accepted limitations, and who had the courage to act on his convictions when lives hung in the balance. When we examine why some innovate while others merely follow, when we consider the qualities that allow certain individuals to see beyond established doctrine, we find ourselves confronting profound questions about courage, institutional thinking, and the nature of progress itself. Would you have broken the order or obeyed it? In countless military briefing rooms around the world today, instructors still tell the story of Michael Harkins and the Leipzig mission as a lesson in the value of tactical innovation and the courage to challenge established doctrine when circumstances demand it. His legacy lives on not just in military textbooks, but in the DNA of modern aerial combat tactics. Share this remarkable story of an ordinary man who saved thousands through mathematical insight and tactical courage, a hero whose name deserves to be remembered alongside the greatest innovators in military history.